This is Mary Magdalene's final night. The world sees her as a sinner, a grieving woman, but she carries a secret far more dangerous than any crime, the key to wholeness. And in this quiet night, she faces the truth society tried to bury, the truth about the power of the feminine soul. This is not merely a biblical tale. It is a journey into the psychology of Carl Jung. Magdalene embodies the archetype of the anima, the intuitive, sacred principle the patriarchy pushed into the shadow. Her fate mirrors our own, the struggle to reclaim what was silenced. In this narrative, we descend into the collective shadow that condemned her, the ancient fear of intuition and the force of the feminine. And we discover that her true strength was never granted by forgiveness from the outside, but the inner integration of the self, the return to totality. The story of Magdalene is your permission slip, permission to reclaim your voice, your intuition, your deepest truth. It is the path back home, to the house of the soul. If you seek to understand the force that lives in wholeness, and if you feel the quiet pull of your own awakening, do not walk this journey alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories so YouTube can sense the depth of this work and continue guiding you along your own path of individuation. Leave a like and let us uncover the mystery of the feminine soul. The first and deepest act of violence against Mary Magdalene was not physical. It was an act of collective psychological projection. Society, and the dogma of her time, desperately needed a scapegoat, and Magdalene became the perfect symbol, the sinner, the fallen woman. But what, exactly, was the power structure of that era punishing in her? Carl Jung taught us that the collective shadow is the vast repository of every trait, instinct, and power that a society or an entire age refuses to accept within itself. It is the civilization's unconscious. In that emerging culture, doctrine had grown overly rational, structured, and masculine, the realm of the logos. And this principle feared above all the untamable force of eros, intuition, deep feeling, direct connection, and yes, feminine sexuality as a sacred current. Magdalene, with her spiritual autonomy, her emotional depth, and her direct knowledge of truth, was a living, breathing threat. She embodied the possibility that the key to the divine did not belong solely to hierarchical rules, but to an inner experience. So, to protect its collective persona, that carefully polished facade of order, purity, and rigid hierarchy, the world needed to demonize her. And the collective shadow, made of misogyny, fear of feminine power, and terror of emotional chaos, was poured over Mary Magdalene. This condemnation was never a moral verdict. It was a cold act of psychological survival. By branding her a prostitute or a sinner, society reassured itself with the lie. The danger isn't in our repression, nor in our rules. The danger is in her. And thus they stripped her of dignity, forcing Magdalene to carry the archetypal burden of the repressed sacred feminine. Her pain became the literal pain of every woman whose intuition was called hysteria, whose power was renamed curse or sin through centuries of fear. The world was healing itself at her expense. The result of this forced projection was the theft of identity. Magdalene was no longer seen as disciple, spiritual beloved, or confidant. She was flattened into a single, hollow stereotype. Society, blinded by its own shadow, could not see her as a whole woman, the bearer of totality, but only as the mirror of its own guilt and its own repressed desire. For Jung, projection is a defense mechanism. The psyche refuses to face its own blind spots, and instead assigns them to someone else. In Magdalene, this mechanism expanded into a collective scale. An entire civilization was fleeing from its intuitive, emotional nature. By condemning Magdalene, they were unconsciously condemning the feminine side of every individual psyche. The cost for her was the relentless struggle between the truth of herself and the lie of the persona forced upon her. How could she carry the message of resurrection, a message of soul's wholeness, when society had reduced her own soul to half, to the sinner? This inner fracture became her cross. Society robbed her of the right to be complex, to be fully human. And yet, within this extreme conflict lay the seed of her power. Magdalene's story is not merely a tragedy, it is the catalyst for individuation. So fiercely attacked by the collective shadow, she was driven inward, pushed into the depths of her own unconscious to find a source of truth immune to the world's judgment. The garden that night was her battlefield and her sanctuary. She was not only grieving physical absence, she was confronting for the first time the colossal lie that had stolen her soul. The forced separation from the master and the isolation that followed compelled her to internalize wholeness. What the world sought to punish, her soul was now ready to integrate. Her final act of courage would not be to confront doctrine publicly, but to strip the collective shadow from her own identity, purify her inner truth, and begin the long journey of rescuing her authentic self. This inner separation, self, from collective shadow, is the most powerful message she carries into the modern world. But to carry that message of wholeness, Magdalene needed one final certainty. She needed to prove to herself that her wisdom was equal to his, that her intuition was as valid as the law. She needed to confront the animus, the masculine principle within her own soul, to confirm she was worthy of the truth she had been given. And that moment of reckoning was about to unfold. Mary Magdalene's journey, after confronting the judgment of the collective shadow, led her to the most intimate battlefield of all, her own interior. To carry the message of wholeness, she needed an unshakable certainty, a source of authority that not even the apostles could question. That authority could only arise from the integration of her inner masculine. In Jungian terms, the animus is the masculine aspect of the feminine psyche. It holds reason, discernment, the impulse toward action, and the anchor of spiritual authority. By condemning her, society sought not only to suppress her anima, her intuition and feeling, but to disqualify her animus, insisting that a woman could receive truth only through a male intermediary. Magdalene's challenge was immense. She had to validate her knowledge, her intuitive gnosis, before the realm of the logos, law, external reason, patriarchal certainty. For this, her animus could not remain passive. It had to be integrated, transformed, awakened. The strength she used to defend the master, or to stand against dogma, was not superficial rebellion. It was the masculine principle within her soul rising to its rightful place. Magdalene was not seeking the approval of Peter or John. She was seeking the approval of her own mind. She needed her inner reason to confirm the truth her heart, her eros, already knew. This integration is what sets her apart. While the male disciples struggled to believe in the event, Magdalene knew, because her psyche had already united faith with reason. The nature of her relationship with the Master must be seen through the lens of individuation. It was not romantic, nor hierarchical. It was an archetypal partnership. The Master, in his archetypal form, was the self for Magdalene, the symbol of wholeness, the path toward the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, reason and intuition, body and spirit. The depth of their connection allowed her to witness the resurrection on a level that transcends the physical, the level of the soul. She did not need historical proof. She carried the psychological proof. Her animus was strong enough to recognize that what had died was the body, but the archetype was eternal. She saw the pattern beneath the event, the wholeness the event was pointing toward. Her love, therefore, became the catalyst for her own authority. She was not a passive follower, but an active bearer of truth. By integrating her animus, she became the first apostle of the resurrection, the only one capable of carrying the message to those still bound by the logic of loss and judgment. This inner union of masculine and feminine, animus and anima, transformed her into the archetype of the whole woman. She did not oppose the masculine. She absorbed it, balanced it, redeemed it. This was the final proof of her wisdom and the reason she did not fall into despair. Her source of power was internal, therefore immune to death and to dogma. Yet the world still demanded that she return to her role of submission and tears. The apostles, though well-intentioned, remained bound to the rules of the Logos, searching for concrete proof. But Magdalene had received the proof that only the soul can offer. She was ready to deliver the message, but one final doubt hovered over her. Would the integration of this inner strength turn her as rigid and solitary as the very dogma that had condemned her? Her mission now was to show that authority, the animus, could coexist with compassion, the anima. She needed to become the first to demonstrate that true strength lives in wholeness, in the union of heart and mind. And this test, the test of holding her intuitive truth intact in the presence of skeptical reason, was about to manifest in the exact moment she reached out to touch the proof of her faith. Magdalene had proven her worth to herself by integrating her animus. But as she reached for the proof of what she believed, she heard the most enigmatic words, words that sealed her destiny, and forever separated her from the world's understanding. Noli me tangere. Do not touch me.
The encounter with truth did not bring her social relief. It brought isolation. Magdalene had integrated her animus, her inner authority, and welcomed her anima, her intuition. But the world, and even her closest companions, were not ready for such wholeness. Instead, they rejected her. The same collective shadow that once branded her a sinner now appeared through the disciples' skepticism and disbelief. They were searching for proof, the factual evidence of the Logos, while Magdalene held certainty, the intuitive experience of eros. Her encounter was personal, inward, and therefore impossible to reduce into the rules or proofs they demanded. This moment of separation was cruel but essential. Magdalene realized that the truth she carried could never be validated by those still trapped in the mind's binary divisions. Her former companions, still seeking authority outside themselves, projected onto her not malice but misunderstanding. They saw her as too emotional or too visionary, new labels for the same ancient rejection of the sacred feminine. Magdalene was forced to make a radical decision, to abandon the need to be believed. Her path could no longer be the path of the collective, but the path of gnosis, the direct knowing of the soul. It was the moment of radical self-acceptance. She accepted that her truth was hers alone, and that her own approval was the only authority that mattered. This journey towards solitude was not abandonment, it was an act of self-preservation. By stepping away, she protected the purity of the message from dogmatic judgment. The emptiness that followed was not a void of meaning, but a void of external dependency. There was no more hierarchy. She had become her own spiritual authority. She became the archetype of the pilgrim, the woman who carries the sacred truth across the roads of the world. Noli me tangere was not only an external prohibition, it was Magdalene's inner command. Do not touch the old self. Do not return to the old structure of power or affection. Wholeness is now within. She needed to release the final remnants of needing masculine validation. The world wanted Magdalene to carry the message of submission, but she carried the message of the union of opposites. She accepted her shadow, the sinner. She integrated her animus, reason, and authority. She listened to her anima, her intuition. The wholeness, the self, she reached, was the only true inheritance she carried from the resurrection. The Master had fulfilled his role as catalyzing force. The work of individuation was now entirely hers. Her mission became to carry the legacy of feeling. The principle of the Logos already had its followers. Her message was for those who sought truth through the heart, through experience, through intuition. She became the source of a wisdom that could never be written in laws, but had to be lived in silence. The weight of collective projection was replaced by the lightness of her individual mission to show that healing does not come from hierarchy, but from listening to the soul. Magdalene became the living proof that an individual's greatest strength is the ability to remain whole in a world that demands division. She was wholeness walking, the liberated anima, and her next step would be an act of pure synchronicity, guided not by reason, but by the necessity that her story be carried to the places where the heart had been the most repressed. Magdalene had freed herself from the need to be validated by the world. Now her destiny called her toward the sea. Where would she go? The answer lived in the legends, in the wisdom of the earth, and in the intuition that only the liberated sacred feminine can hear. After Magdalene performed the act of radical self-acceptance, after freeing herself from the need to be validated by the apostles' skepticism, she entered a new and frightening kind of isolation. It was not the isolation imposed by judgment, it was the void of certainty. The Master, her spiritual catalyst, was gone. The collective shadow had been cast off. At the center of her soul, there was only silence. This solitude confronted her with the final and most insidious doubt the mind can create. What if I am wrong? What if my gnosis, my intuitive knowing, was nothing but hysteria, as they implied? What if the wholeness I felt was merely a mirror of my desperate need for meaning? This is the dark night of the soul, the moment when the seeker must face the possibility that the entire journey might have been built on illusion. Carl Jung would describe this period as the moment when the ego must shed its last remaining projections, a painful but necessary dissolution. While the master was physically present, there was still the danger that Magdalene might project her own inner divinity, the self, onto him. The emptiness she now felt forced her to withdraw that projection. She had to prove that her faith rested in her own inner experience and not in any external figure. The Logos tried to convince her that without proof, there could be no truth. The void awakened a primordial fear, the terror of final abandonment, not only the loss of the physical beloved, but the fear of being abandoned by truth itself. For the inner Magdalene, the wounded child, the emptiness felt like an ending. It was the ego's final maneuver, clinging to the security of having an external source of power. But she had become the pilgrim, and the pilgrim knows that the only map is the unconscious. The crisis deepened into acceptance. She had to confront the shadow of being entirely alone, the acceptance that truth is often a path for the few. This is the point where many turn back, seeking comfort and dogma. But Magdalene had tasted wholeness. She refused to return. Surrendering to the void was not a defeat, but a final victory over the fear of not belonging. Magdalene understood that the fear of emptiness was only the last illusion. By surrendering to it, she found fullness. She stopped seeking proof in the past and opened herself to the flow of the future, the path her intuition, her anima, had been whispering. The fear dissolved into the certainty that her mission was never to convince anyone, but to live the truth that had transformed her, even if it meant walking alone. The transmutation of that pain was the final act of her individuation, her becoming whole. What the world saw as loneliness, Magdalene internalized as absolute authority. She had no temple. Her body was the temple. She had no sermon. Her life was the sermon. This wholeness, forged in crisis, set her free. The command, "Noli me tangere," resonated in her soul. It was not merely about not clinging to the master's body. It was about not clinging to the old self, the self that relied on external authority to validate its faith. She had become the source, the center, the feminine self in motion. She became the living proof that revelation is personal, intimate, and immune to hierarchy. Magdalene's path was no longer Galilee, nor the desert, nor Jerusalem. Her path was mythopoiesis, the creation of a personal myth of freedom and authenticity. She had become the legend her own unconscious required, and by accepting the void, she filled it with her own essence. She was wholeness. The fear was gone. Only the intuitive direction remained. Magdalene had become her own authority. But where would the liberated sacred feminine lead her? History tells us the answer lived in the wisdom of the earth, in the hidden legends, in the roots that link the soul to absolute freedom. Her final destiny was not written in the Gospels, but in the sea. Magdalene had survived the void, but now she faced the final consequence, the absence made flesh. The one who had been the catalyst of her wholeness, herself, the anchor of her truth, was gone. Her grief was not only for the beloved person, but for the loss of the object of her projection, a loss that was necessary. The emptiness of the tomb was not a mystery to be solved by reason. It was a psychological command. It whispered, "Wholeness is not out there. Wholeness is within you." This became the true turning point in the narrative of Magdalene's soul. Carl Jung would argue that the master, in his archetypal form, had fulfilled his role as guide of the self. The psychic energy Magdalene had projected onto the external figure had to be withdrawn and internalized. The body disappeared, so she could find the spirit, the essence, inside herself. Magdalene's grief then transmuted into gnosis, direct knowing. She realized that the master's message was never about the story. It was about the archetype. The event of the resurrection was not an isolated miracle, but the archetypal pattern of psychic transformation, the union of opposites, life rising from death, light emerging from shadow. She saw the language of the unconscious unfolding in the world around her. Her mission was not to mourn the loss, but to carry the archetype of resurrection. This freed her from dogma. She needed no rules, for she carried the experience. The wholeness she felt was the union of the sacred feminine, eros, with the spiritual masculine, logos. She became the living proof that integration is possible. There was no longer separation between body and soul. There was only wholeness. What the world sought as miracle, Magdalene understood as psychic process. And this is why she was chosen first, because she was the only one prepared to internalize the truth completely. Her pain became the fuel for her final authority. Magdalene's experience in the garden was not passive. It was a command of action. The power of the self asserted itself over the emptiness. She realized her mission now was to carry the message of individuation, the journey toward becoming whole into a world increasingly divided. She became the bearer of the only real hope, that every human being can find their own wholeness, even when the world demands fragmentation. Her certainty was unshakable because it was self-generated. She no longer needed external proof. The proof lived in her own transformation. The collective shadow that condemned her could no longer touch her, for she had integrated her own shadow. She could no longer be labeled. She was wholeness walking. Magdalene became the evidence that final healing does not come from external help, but from the courage to face the void and find the self there. She was the messenger of the divine within, and her voice, the one the world had tried to silence, was now ready to proclaim the truth that wholeness resides in all of us. Magdalene had become wholeness itself. But what she heard next, Noli me tangere, was not merely a warning, but the final and most essential lesson about the true meaning of freedom. A lesson that would force her to choose between the old personal love and the new archetypal love.
The encounter culminates in one of the most enigmatic and misunderstood phrases in the Gospels, "Noli me tangere," do not touch me. On the literal level, it appears to be a simple prohibition, but in the language of analytical psychology, it is the final and most crucial lesson in freedom Magdalene needed to complete her individuation. Magdalene had sought reunion with the Master in the personal physical form, the love object. But the Master, in his archetypal form, now embodied the transcendent,
The physical touch was no longer the point of connection. Their bond had to evolve from personal to spiritual, from human to archetypal. Carl Jung would say this was the moment she had to withdraw the projection of the self from the external object. If Magdalene were to touch the resurrected body, she risked regressing into the old way of being, clinging to the security of the beloved object, depending on an external presence to validate her faith. She would be reduced again to the disciple rather than the autonomous bearer of wholeness. The prohibition was in truth a command toward autonomy. Do not touch me meant do not cling to the old ways of loving and depending. The proof of my presence is no longer in the touch, but in the certainty I awakened in you. Authority now resides in your own self. Magdalene needed to transform passionate love into wise love. This command forced her into the final transmutation of her animus. If her animus, reason and authority, had previously been integrated to defend her gnosis, now it had to integrate to free her from her last attachment. Logos and eros united to teach her that wholeness is internal and non-transferable. This lesson sealed Magdalene's destiny as the archetype of the whole woman. She did not merely believe in the resurrection, she became its psychological reflection. The resurrected body was the symbol that life, the self, always rises after the death of the ego. Magdalene no longer needed proof, she was the proof. The phrase, "do not touch me," thus becomes Magdalene's declaration of independence. She is no longer the sinner crafted by the collective shadow, nor the dependent follower. She is the free woman who carries the truth. Her legacy is not biography, but permission. Permission for all people, men and women alike, to seek the sacred within themselves, without intermediaries. She becomes the key to the path of individuation. Magdalene now holds unquestionable authority to carry the message. The physical separation ensures that her truth remains pure, uncontaminated by the need for others' validation. She alone understands the archetypal meaning, and this understanding makes her the first apostle of wholeness. Magdalene had completed the deepest of transformations, but to carry wholeness into a fragmented world was a burden. Where would she take her wisdom, and how would she protect it from the collective shadow that still pursued her? The answer lay in the sea, in the search for a place where truth could finally take root and flourish. Magdalene had obeyed the command, noli me tangere, and in doing so transcended personal pain, becoming an archetypal legacy. Her final destiny was no longer to seek the master, but to become the messenger of wholeness. Her physical body was safe from touch, and her soul free from external dependence. Her legacy became the living proof of the need to restore the sacred feminine, eros. In a world ruled by the rigidity of logos, the masculine reason, where logos insists on hierarchy and separation, Magdalene's eros insists on connection and wholeness. The essence of her legacy is permission. Permission for feminine intuition to be regarded as spiritual authority. Permission for knowledge to be felt, not merely reasoned. Permission for woman, and for the anima within every man, to be whole, without needing external validation. Magdalene became the face of individuation for the feminine principle. Her path revealed that wholeness, the encounter with the self, is not a masculine privilege, nor a dogmatic reward. It is reached when one has the courage to integrate the shadow, instincts, sexuality, the forbidden emotions, and the animus, strength, discernment, into a unified being. Her legacy is that strength is not found in suppressing tears, as the collective shadow once demanded, but in weaving them into wisdom. She proved that the woman who accepts her vulnerability is in truth the strongest of all, for she does not fear the totality of her human experience. Her separation from the apostles, though painful, ensured that her message would remain pure. She carried the message of the body, the wisdom that spirit is present in matter, in contrast with the message of dogma, which too often tried to deny the body and the feeling. The legacy of Mary Magdalene does not belong to the past, it belongs to us. Her story is the mirror that reveals how much our own society, our modern collective shadow, still tries to fragment us. How often are we labeled too emotional or too visionary when we are merely expressing our sacred feminine? Magdalene's call is for all of us, men and women, to reclaim the anima and the eros that were exiled. It is an invitation to trust intuition beneath the pressure of logic, and to honor feeling as a legitimate form of wisdom. Her legacy is that the most radical act of faith is often the courage to believe in oneself. Magdalene, the pilgrim, continued her journey in silence. Her life became a legend because she had achieved what we all seek, the peace that emerges from the radical acceptance of who one is, with all the shadows, all the light, and all the authority of the self. Magdalene had given us the key to wholeness, but the key must be used. What did she do with that wisdom on her solitary path? The answer lies in her final destination, in the legends that refuse to die, and in her own unconscious. Magdalene had reached wholeness. Yet to carry that wholeness through a world still trapped in fragmentation, the collective shadow, was unsustainable. To preserve the purity of her gnosis, her direct knowing of the soul, she needed one final act of separation, the solitary journey. This journey, told in apocryphal legends, is the psychological epilogue of her story. Magdalene leaves not out of fear, but out of spiritual necessity. Her body and her message could not be absorbed by the rigid dogmatic structure of Jerusalem. She needed to travel to a land where the sacred feminine could still bloom, far from the domain of the logos. Carl Jung saw the solitary journey as the critical phase of individuation, the moment when the individual must prove that the wholeness attained is strong enough to exist without the support of the collective. For Magdalene, this meant stepping into a boat with no destination, trusting only the intuitive principle she had reclaimed. Magdalene's destiny, according to the legends, led her to the shores of what is now France. The symbolism runs deep. The sea represents the collective unconscious, the womb of creation, the realm of the primordial feminine. Magdalene was literally surrendering herself to the domain of her anima, leaving land-bound reason to follow water-bound intuition. She carried no scrolls, no rules, only the legacy of feeling. Her mission was not to convert nations, but to plant the seed of wholeness in soil where it could take root, among druids, Celtic goddesses, and cultures in which the feminine principle was still revered. She became the bridge between Eastern wisdom and the chthonic energies of the West. By living this life of the pilgrim, she embodied integration. She used strength, her integrated animus, to navigate, and intuition, her integrated anima, to choose her path. Her solitary existence became a living prayer, the proof that final healing is self-generated and immune to persecution. The legends suggest that Magdalene did not die. She dissolved into the very earth, becoming an immortal archetype of intuitive knowledge. Her body became the relic not through miracle, but through knowing. She passed her gnosis, her vision of wholeness, to those capable of receiving it, the marginalized, the women, the mystics who sought truth outside official structures. Her final legacy is not only the search for the self, but the legacy of the shadow. By accepting her past, the sinner, and integrating it with her future, the sage, she taught us that redemption is not the denial of the dark, but its acceptance and integration. Wholeness, the self, is achieved only when we recognize divinity within our humanity, with all its flaws and all its radiance. Magdalene's solitary journey, far from being exile, was the manifestation of her final freedom. She was the first to prove that true authority belongs to the one who dares to be whole, even if that means walking alone. She was wholeness, and her life was the message. Magdalene had completed the work. She left us the legacy of the shadow and the sacred feminine. Now her story becomes a mirror for our own. What did she do with her wholeness? And what will you do with the truth she left us? Mary Magdalene's journey ends where all true journeys begin, within us. She has given us the key, not a golden key, but a key of radical acceptance. Magdalene, bearer of the liberated sacred feminine, taught us that the greatest danger is not the world's judgment, the collective shadow, but our own judgment of ourselves. The denial of our own eros, our own feeling, our own intuition. Her legacy is not meant to be admired from afar. It is meant to be lived. The wholeness she reached is our own self, waiting to be discovered. Her story is the mirror that asks, what part of you did society force into hiding? What power did you condemn to the shadow just to be seen as acceptable or strong? Magdalene's wisdom can be distilled into a single psychological command: accept the shadow. Not to be punished by it, but to integrate the strength it guards. Your tears, your anger, your vulnerability, all of these are the language of your soul. Strength does not live in repression, but in wholeness. Magdalene proved that true authority belongs to the one who has the courage to be human. And humanity is the union of reason with the heart. She stands as the proof that the final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own evidence. If Magdalene's story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and your inner wholeness, your soul work, your shadow work must begin now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and activate the bell so you never miss the next archetypal journey. Our channel is not just about stories. It is about transforming pain into wisdom and turning what was silenced into voice. Leave a like if you also believe in the power of wholeness, and click the video now appearing on your screen to continue your descent into the journey of the self. Remember, your self is waiting. Wholeness is your destiny.